You think this is about the suit, he spat, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the polished oak of the dining table. The question hung in the air, thick with accusation and a smug certainty that I was missing something fundamentally obvious that only understood. It was the kind of question designed to belittle, to shrink me down to a size where my concerns were trivial, my reactions overblown. My stomach tightened, a familiar clench that had become a permanent resident over the years. This was Sunday dinner at my in-laws. The ritual. The carefully curated performance of a harmonious, successful family. My husband, Mark, sat beside me, his jaw already set, his eyes fixed on his father with an almost aggressive deference. My father-in-law, Arthur, was a man who wore his achievements like a second skin, his suits always impeccable, his pronouncements delivered with the weight of immutable law. His wife, Eleanor, a woman who perfected the art of benevolent martyrdom, watched us all with a practiced, placid smile. My life, until recently, had been a series of these dinners, navigating the subtle currents of their expectations, offering up polite smiles and agreeable nods, absorbing the unspoken criticisms that dripped like water torture. Arthur's suit, a charcoal gray masterpiece that probably cost more than my car, was currently sporting a rather unfortunate crimson stain blooming across the lapel. A deep, rich Cabernet. The offending wine glass lay on its side on the rug, a silent testament to a moment of clumsiness. Or, as Arthur would have it, a deliberate act of disrespect. Arthur was in the middle of recounting a tale of his own business acumen, a story he'd told a dozen times, each iteration more grandiose than the last. He gestured emphatically, and his wine glass, precariously balanced on a stack of meticulously arranged coasters, tumbled. I saw it happen in slow motion, the arc of the glass, the dark liquid spilling like blood onto his pristine lapel. My immediate instinct was to reach for a napkin, to try and staunch the damage, but Arthur's roar stopped me cold. "What do you think you're doing?" he boomed, his face darkening, not with wine, but with pure, unadulterated fury. He wasn't asking about my intention to help. He was implying a malice, a deliberate sabotage. Mark immediately began to apologize, his words tumbling over each other in a desperate attempt to smooth his father's ruffled feathers. Eleanor tooted, her gaze flicking from the stain to my face, a silent indictment. This wasn't about the wine. Not really. It was about Arthur's need to control, to dominate, to extract apologies and obeisance. It was about the performance, and my failure to play my part perfectly. My father-in-law's outrage wasn't about fabric and fermented grapes, it was about a perceived insult to his authority, to his very being. And Mark, bless his perpetually anxious heart, was already ready to fall on his sword to protect his father's ego. The pattern was etched deep. Years ago, before Mark and I were married, during a particularly tense family vacation, I'd suggested a different restaurant than the one Arthur had already booked. Not a critique, just a mild suggestion. He'd frozen, his eyes narrowing. "Are you questioning my judgment?" he'd asked, the same dangerous calm he'd used tonight, before the roar. Mark had immediately jumped in. "No, Dad, she didn't mean it like that, she just..." He'd trailed off, unable to defend me against the implied charge of insubordination. I learned then that my opinions were tolerated only when they aligned with Arthur's. Then there was the matter of the inheritance. My grandmother, a woman who had meticulously saved and invested every spare penny, had left a modest sum. Enough to make a difference, certainly. Arthur, who had always considered my family beneath his own in terms of financial standing, had taken a keen interest. When the will was read, and it turned out my grandmother had left me a small collection of antique jewelry in addition to the cash, Arthur had managed a tight-lipped smile. But later, at a family gathering, I overheard him talking to Mark. "She's lucky," he'd said, his voice laced with a superiority I'd come to loathe. "She should be grateful for whatever she gets. Some people just don't know how to manage." He'd then proceeded to offer Mark advice on how to help me manage my inheritance, implying I was incapable. Mark, again, had deflected, but the seed of his father's condescension had been planted. These were not dramatic confrontations. They were subtle erosions, quiet dismissals, the constant drip of entitlement that wore away at my self-worth. I'd learned to absorb it, to nod, to smile, to retreat into my own silence. My internal world became a fortress, the only place I felt safe from their judgments. Mark, caught between his parents and me, developed a remarkable talent for appeasing, for diffusing, for never rocking the boat. He loved me, I knew, but he also loved the illusion of peace, the smooth functioning of his family unit, a unit dictated by Arthur's rules. Back to the wine incident. The stain was spreading, a dark bloom on the expensive wool. Arthur was glaring at me, his chest puffed out. Mark was already on his feet, grabbing a linen napkin. "Dad, I'm so sorry," Mark stammered, dabbing feebly at the stain. "I'll have it professionally cleaned immediately, of course. I'll take it to the best place in town." Arthur waved his hand dismissively, a gesture that swept away Mark's apology and, by extension, my perceived offense. "Cleaned? This is a bespoke suit, Mark. Imported Italian wool. Some things can't be simply cleaned. He turned his icy gaze back to me. "This is an inconvenience. A significant inconvenience. And I expect an apology for your carelessness." The silence in the room amplified. Eleanor's placid smile had tightened, her eyes now fixed on me with a flicker of anticipation. She, like Arthur, thrived on these displays of dominance, on the spectacle of someone being brought to heel. Mark looked at me, his expression a mixture of pleading and expectation. He wanted me to say the words. He wanted me to absorb the blow, to give his father the satisfaction of seeing me humbled. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the enforced stillness. I could feel the blood draining from my face. The words, "I'm sorry," felt like ash in my mouth. They were false. I hadn't spilled the wine. Arthur had. His clumsy gesture, his self-absorbed storytelling, had caused the stain. Yet, here I was, expected to grovel for a consequence of action, a consequence he was twisting into transgression. I looked at Arthur. His face was a mask of self-importance, his eyes demanding. I looked at Mark. He was a mirror of his father's expectations, a conduit for his approval. And in that moment, something shifted. The years of swallowing insults, of silent endurance, of performing a role I never chose, coalesced into a single, stark realization. I didn't owe him an apology. I didn't owe him my dignity. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping lightly against the polished floor. The sound seemed deafening in the charged silence. Mark flinched, expecting me to move towards his father. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "I did not spill your wine, Arthur," I said, my voice remarkably steady, devoid of tremor. "You did." The air crackled. Arthur's face went from smug indignation to outright disbelief. Mark's jaw dropped. Eleanor's carefully constructed smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned shock. "What did you say?" Arthur's voice was dangerously soft, the prelude to a storm. "I said," I repeated, meeting his gaze directly, "that you spilled your own wine. And while I regret any damage to your suit, I am not responsible for your actions, and therefore, I will not be apologizing for them." Mark finally found his voice, a strangled whisper. "Honey, what are you doing? Just apologize." I turned to him, my gaze unwavering. "No, Mark. I won't. This is not about your father's suit. It's about his expectation that I will always bend, always apologize, always accept his blame. I'm tired of it." Arthur stood up, his imposing frame seeming to swell with indignation. "You will leave this house. Now. And don't expect to be invited back." A strange sense of calm settled over me. The storm had broken, and I was standing in its eye. "That's quite all right, Arthur," I said, gathering my purse. I was just about to leave anyway. I didn't look at Mark. I didn't look at Eleanor. I walked out of the dining room, through the hall and out the front door, leaving the perfectly set table, the half-eaten roast, and the crimson stain behind. The cool night air was a balm against my skin. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away. The next few days were a blur of frantic calls and increasingly irate voicemails. Mark was beside himself. His father had apparently threatened to cut him off financially if he didn't deal with me. Eleanor, usually the conciliator, had taken her husband's side with a vehemence that was almost alarming. Their flying monkeys, aunts, uncles, cousins, descended, all delivering the same message: just apologize. It's not worth this. I ignored them all. I focused on the documents I'd meticulously gathered. For years, I'd been quietly managing my grandmother's inheritance. Arthur, with his constant insinuations about my financial incompetence, had spurred me to become even more diligent. I'd invested wisely, diversified, and built a substantial nest egg, entirely separate from Mark's, and certainly from Arthur's influence. On Wednesday morning, Mark showed up at my apartment, his face etched with exhaustion and desperation. He pleaded, he argued, he reasoned. He painted a picture of Arthur's unyielding wrath, of the potential fallout for his own career. He's serious, Sarah, he said, his voice cracking. He's talking about the business, about the trust funds. He said he'll disinherit me if I don't make you apologize. I listened, my expression unreadable. When he finally ran out of words, I stood up and walked to my desk. I opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Mark, I said, my voice soft but firm. You remember that business deal your father was so proud of, the one that supposedly made his fortune? The one where he claimed he outsmarted everyone? He nodded, wary. I have the original incorporation papers, I continued, laying a document on the table. And the amendments. Your father's signature is on all of them. But so is yours, from when you were 22 and he convinced you it was a family venture. I slid another document towards him. This is the shareholder agreement. And this, I tapped a third sheet, is the clause that states if a shareholder is found to be engaging in fraudulent practices, their shares can be nullified. Mark stared at the papers, his face draining of color. He knew what I was implying. Arthur had a reputation for questionable business dealings, for leveraging his authority to gain an unfair advantage. I'd spent countless hours, fueled by a quiet, cold rage, digging into his past. What are you doing? He whispered, his eyes wide with dawning horror. I'm not going to tell anyone, Mark, I said, the words like ice. Not yet. But I've also been paying attention to Arthur's investments. And I've noticed some interesting patterns. Things that might catch the attention of the SEC, perhaps. I didn't need to say more. The implication was clear. If Arthur pushed me, if he tried to ruin me, I had the power to ruin him. I had proof of his shady past, and evidence that his current empire might be built on shaky foundations. Mark looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear, not for me, but for himself, for his inheritance, for his carefully constructed life. He finally understood that my silence had not been weakness, but a calculated reserve. He left shortly after, not with a plea, but with a defeated slump of his shoulders. The frantic calls stopped. The flying monkeys fell silent. Arthur, it turned out, was more concerned about the potential exposure of his questionable business practices than about his son's marriage or my supposed insult. The threat of financial ruin, far more potent than any spilled wine, had effectively silenced him. The final consequence wasn't a public spectacle. It was a quiet severing. Mark and I are separated. He's still trying to salvage his relationship with his father, but the power dynamic has irrevocably shifted. Arthur, I've heard, is noticeably less boisterous, his pronouncements more guarded. The stain on his suit has faded, but the stain on his reputation and his ego remains. And me? I'm finally breathing. The fortress of my internal world has expanded, no longer a defense, but a space to simply be. The satisfaction isn't in his downfall, but in the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I refuse to be diminished. I didn't need to shout, to scream, or to fight. I simply stood my ground, and the edifice of his arrogance crumbled under its own weight. The silence that followed wasn't an absence of noise, but the profound, peaceful quiet of having finally reclaimed myself.